I found my lost son in a cemetery. The story that changed my life. The rain fell in a steady drizzle that morning, turning the cemetery paths into trails of glistening stones. The gray sky seemed heavy, almost as if it, too, mourned with me. I held a bouquet of white lilies in my hands, their fragrance faint against the chill in the air. These were her favorite flowers, my wife's. Bringing them to her grave had become a ritual, one of the few constants left in my life. I walked slowly, my steps heavy, not just from age but from the weight of everything I carried. It had been years since she had passed, and yet the ache in my chest hadn't dulled. If anything, it had grown sharper, carving deeper into the parts of me I thought had already been hollowed out. Losing her was unbearable, but the loss of our son, that was a wound that would never heal. He was just 5 years old when the flood came. The evacuation had been chaotic. Sirens blared, people shouted, and the streets filled with a mixture of panicked families and rising water. We had been holding hands, but in the confusion, in the chaos of running to higher ground, he was pulled away. I could still hear his cries sometimes, echoing in my dreams. We searched for days, weeks, months, but the flood took everything, including my son. And though I never stopped searching, it felt as if the world had swallowed him whole. I reached her grave, the stone worn from years of rain and wind. Her name was etched there, along with the dates that marked her life. I knelt, placing the lilies carefully at the base of the stone, and let out a long, shaky breath. "I miss you," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I miss you both." As I stood, my knees protesting the movement, I noticed a figure out of the corner of my eye. A boy, no, a young man, was kneeling by a nearby grave. He couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, dressed in worn jeans and a thin jacket that looked ill-suited for the weather. His shoulders were hunched, trembling slightly, and he clutched a small bouquet of flowers in one hand. Something about him caught my attention, though I couldn't place what it was. I told myself to look away, to give him privacy. But as I turned, I heard a muffled sound, a quiet sob, barely audible over the rain. The sound rooted me in place. It wasn't just the cry of sadness. It was the sound of someone carrying a pain far too heavy for his young shoulders. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. "Are you all right, son?" I asked gently, my voice just loud enough to be heard over the rain. The boy startled, his head snapping up. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed red. I'm fine," he stammered, quickly wiping at his face as if to hide the evidence of his tears. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother anyone." "You're not bothering me," I said softly. "Sometimes it helps to talk." He hesitated, his grip on the flowers tightening. For a moment, I thought he might ignore me, but then he spoke, his voice quiet and raw. "I'm just visiting my dad. He died 5 years ago." There was a weight to his words, a grief that seemed far older than him. "I'm sorry," I said. "Losing someone you love, it's the hardest thing." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the grave in front of him. "He was all I had," he said, his voice trembling. "And it was my fault." My chest tightened at his words. "What do you mean?" The boy shook his head, tears streaming down his face now despite his best efforts to hold them back. "If I hadn't run away that night, if I hadn't been such a problem, he wouldn't have come after me. He wouldn't have..." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. I didn't know what to say. His pain was so raw, so familiar, that it felt like looking into a mirror. I had spent years blaming myself for what happened to my son, for not holding his hand tighter, for not being faster, braver, better. I recognized that same guilt in this boy, and it made my heart ache for him. "Listen," I said, kneeling beside him despite the protest of my old joints. "Whatever happened, I'm sure your father wouldn't blame you. He loved you, that much is clear." The boy glanced at me, his expression torn between disbelief and longing. "You don't know that. I don't need to know him to know that. I said. Parents, we love our children, no matter what. And if he came after you, it's because you were worth everything to him. The boy didn't respond, but his tears slowed, his breathing evening out. He seemed to be considering my words, letting them sink in. After a long silence, he finally spoke. Thanks, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry for breaking down like this. You don't even know me. There's nothing to apologize for, I said. Sometimes, talking to a stranger can help more than you'd expect. He offered a faint, hesitant smile before looking back at the grave. I visit him every week, he said. I feel closer to him here. I understand, I replied, thinking of my own visits to this place. It's a way of keeping the connection alive. For a moment, we sat there in silence, two strangers bound by shared grief. But as I looked at him, something stirred deep within me, a sense of familiarity I couldn't shake. His profile, the way his hair curled at the edges, the tilt of his head. It was like looking at a memory brought to life. My heart quickened, but I pushed the thought away. It was impossible. It had to be. The boy stood, brushing the rain from his jacket. I should go, he said, his voice steadier now. Take care of yourself, I said, standing as well. And I'm here most weeks, if you ever need someone to talk to. He nodded, hesitating for a moment before walking away, his figure disappearing into the misty rain. I watched him go, a strange mix of emotions churning in my chest. I didn't know who he was or why he felt so familiar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than coincidence. As I turned back to my wife's grave, a thought echoed in my mind, a thought that refused to be silenced. Could it be him? The next week, the rain was gone, replaced by a pale sun that cast long shadows across the cemetery. The paths were still damp, the air crisp with the faint scent of wet earth. As I made my way to my wife's grave, I couldn't shake the memory of the boy from the previous visit. His face, his voice, his pain, it had all lingered with me, pulling at something deep within. I brought the usual bouquet of lilies, carefully arranged, and placed them at her grave. I'm here again, I whispered. I hope you don't mind me talking about someone else today. My voice faltered. There's this boy. I can't stop thinking about him. He reminded me of... My words caught in my throat, but I forced myself to continue. Of him. I sat by the grave for a while, lost in thought. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Turning, I spotted him again, the boy. He was kneeling by the same grave as before, his figure hunched over, his hands folded in his lap. He seemed calmer this time, less consumed by grief, but there was still a heaviness about him. I hesitated. Was it fate that had brought us back to the same place? Or was I just reading too much into a chance encounter? Either way, my feet moved before my mind could decide, and I found myself walking toward him. Hello again, I said softly when I was close enough. The boy looked up, his expression one of mild surprise. Oh, hi, he said, quickly wiping his hands on his jacket. You're here again. I come every week, I explained, gesturing toward my wife's grave. It's become something of a tradition. He nodded, his gaze flicking back to the headstone in front of him. I do too. It's the only place I feel close to him. I glanced at the grave, reading the name engraved there. It wasn't familiar to me, but that didn't matter. Your dad? I asked gently. He nodded. My adoptive dad, actually. He raised me, gave me everything he could, and then he was gone. I'm sorry, I said sincerely. It sounds like he meant a lot to you. He did, the boy said, his voice quiet but steady. He found me when no one else wanted me. Said I was a gift he didn't know he needed. There was something in his words that made my heart ache. How old were you when he adopted you? About 5, he replied, glancing at me briefly before looking away. They said I was found during a flood. I don't remember much, just bits and pieces. A sharp pang shot through me, 5 years old. Found during a flood? It couldn't be. Or could it? Do you remember anything from before that? I asked cautiously, my throat dry. He shook his head. Not really. Just flashes sometimes. A lot of water, people yelling, someone holding my hand. But I don't even know if those are real memories or just my imagination. I felt a lump forming in my throat. My son had been 5 when he disappeared. We had been holding hands, trying to escape the rising waters, until the crowd separated us. Could this boy, this young man, really be him? You said your dad gave you a good life, I said, trying to steady my voice. Do you have any family now? He shook his head again, his expression clouding. Not anymore. He passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack. I've been on my own since then. The sadness in his voice was almost unbearable. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I didn't know how. That's a lot for someone your age to go through, I said softly. I can see he raised you well. You've got strength in you. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the compliment. I just get by. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling between us. I wanted to ask him more, so much more, but I was afraid of pushing too hard, too fast. Instead, I decided to take a chance, to plant a seed that might lead to answers. I used to have a son, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He was 5 when I lost him. It was during a flood, like the one you mentioned. The boy turned to me, his brow furrowed. What happened to him? I don't know, I admitted, my chest tightening. We got separated in the chaos, and I never found him. I searched for years, but nothing. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. That's awful. I'm sorry. Thank you, I said quietly. It's been a long time, but I still think about him every day, wondering where he is, what kind of person he became. The boy nodded, his gaze distant. Do you have a picture of him? I hesitated, then reached into my pocket. I always carried the photo with me, a snapshot of the life we once had. I handed it to him, my hands trembling slightly. This was him. He took the photo, studying it intently. His face betrayed no emotion at first, but then something flickered in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. This, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. This looks familiar. My heart leapt. What do you mean? He hesitated, as if unsure whether to say more. I think I have this photo, he said finally. At least one like it. It was in a box my dad left me. I stared at him, unable to speak. Could it really be true? Could this boy, this young man, be the son I had thought I'd lost forever? Would you mind bringing it next time? I asked, my voice shaking. I'd like to see it. The boy hesitated, then nodded. Okay, I'll bring it. As he stood to leave, I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what the next meeting would bring, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. The following week felt like a lifetime. I could barely concentrate on anything, my mind consumed with questions, doubts, and an overwhelming hope I didn't dare fully acknowledge. Could this boy truly be my son? It seemed impossible, and yet the details he had shared, the timing, the photo, everything pointed toward a connection. But what if I was wrong? What if I was chasing a dream that would only leave me more broken than before? The cemetery was unusually quiet when I arrived that morning. The autumn leaves, golden and red, crunched beneath my feet as I made my way to the same spot. My hands trembled as I adjusted the flowers on my wife's grave, murmuring, "If this is really happening, give me strength. I don't know what I'll do if it's not him." I didn't have to wait long. The boy appeared, just as he had the last 2 times. His steps were slow and deliberate, his guitar slung over his shoulder this time, a new detail that gave him an air of quiet determination. He spotted me and paused, as if considering whether to approach. When he finally did, his expression was guarded, but not unfriendly. "Morning," he said simply. stopping a few feet away. "Morning, Alex," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He looked down at his feet for a moment, then pulled a small, weathered box from his bag. "I brought it," he said, his tone cautious. I felt my breath catch as he handed the box to me. My fingers brushed against its surface. It was light, the wood worn smooth with age. Carefully, I opened it. Inside were a few keepsakes, an old watch, a keychain, a faded postcard, and there, nestled beneath them, was the photo. My hands shook as I pulled it out. It was the same photo I had given him last week, but this one had been folded and creased, as if it had been handled many times over the years. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked up at Alex, who was watching me intently. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It was in this box," he said, his gaze dropping to the ground. "My dad said it was mine." He didn't tell me much about where I came from, just that he found me after the flood and decided to take me in. A rush of emotion swept over me, almost overwhelming in its intensity. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, each one fitting with an almost terrifying precision. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. "Alex," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "Do you remember anything else about that time? Anything at all?" He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Not much. Just flashes, like I told you before. I remember being scared, and there was a man, someone I think was my real dad, holding my hand. But then he wasn't there anymore." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words hitting me like a tidal wave. That moment, the one I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times, was burned into my memory. The crowd had surged, the water had risen, and his small hand had slipped from mine. I had screamed his name, pushed through the chaos, but he was gone. And now, here he was, standing before me, a young man carrying the weight of a life I hadn't been there to see. "I think that man was me," I said, my voice breaking. "I think I'm your father." Alex froze, his expression a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something I couldn't quite name. You really think so?" "I do," I said, my throat tight. "The photo, the timing, everything you've told me, it all matches. And I never stopped looking for you, Alex. Not for a single day." He stepped back slightly, shaking his head. It's too much. I don't even know you." "I know," I said gently. "I don't expect you to believe me right away. But we can find out for sure. We can do a DNA test." Alex hesitated, his jaw tightening. "And if you're wrong, then I'll accept that," I said firmly. "But if I'm right, I want the chance to be in your life, to make up for the time we've lost." For a long moment, Alex said nothing. The silence between us was heavy, filled with unspoken fears and tentative hopes. Finally, he nodded. "Okay, we can do the test." Relief flooded through me, but I kept my composure. "Thank you," I said softly. "No matter what happens, I'm grateful you're willing to try." He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting back to the grave behind him. "I don't know what to feel right now. My dad, the one who raised me, he's the only one I've ever known. If this is true, it doesn't change what he meant to me." "It shouldn't," I said quickly. "He was your father in every way that mattered. I'm grateful he was there for you when I couldn't be." Alex looked at me then, his gaze searching. "Why are you so sure about this? I mean, what if I'm just someone who reminds you of him? Because I've spent years imagining what he might look like, who he might become," I said, my voice trembling. "And when I look at you, Alex, it's like seeing a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever." His expression softened, though the tension in his shoulders didn't entirely ease. "Okay," he said again. "Let's figure this out." I nodded, a mixture of hope and fear swirling in my chest. "We'll take it one step at a time." As we parted ways that day, I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility, the hope that after all these years, I had finally found my son. But I also knew that hope was fragile, and the truth, whatever it was would change everything. The clinic was quiet when we arrived, its waiting room bathed in sterile white light. Alex sat across from me, his posture stiff, his eyes darting around the room like he wanted to be anywhere else. I couldn't blame him. My own hands were clenched tightly on my lap, my nerves threatening to unravel at any moment. This was the moment of truth, and neither of us was fully prepared for what it might bring. "Are you sure about this?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I looked up, meeting his uncertain gaze. "I am. But the question is, are you?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping restlessly on the arm of his chair. "I guess I have to be. If I don't do this, I'll never know." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Whatever happens, Alex, I just want you to know that I'm here, no matter what the test says." He didn't reply, but his shoulders relaxed slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a sliver of hope. The nurse called us in, her tone brisk and professional. Alex went first, the swab quick and impersonal. When it was my turn, I felt the seconds stretch out, the room impossibly still as the nurse took my sample. It was over in moments, but the implications felt enormous. The results would take days, she told us. Days that would feel like a lifetime. Outside the clinic, Alex stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, avoiding my eyes. "So, what now?" he asked. "Now we wait," I said. "And while we wait, we can talk, or not, whatever you're comfortable with." He sighed, glancing at me briefly before looking away. "Talking feels weird. I don't even know where to start." "Then don't," I said gently. "We don't have to figure everything out today." He nodded, and we began walking, the city bustling around us. The silence between us wasn't entirely comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was a tentative truce, a space where something fragile might grow. The waiting was excruciating. Every day felt like a year, every moment a swirl of anticipation and dread. I busied myself with anything I could, reading, cleaning, even taking longer walks than usual, but my mind always wandered back to Alex. Was he feeling the same way? Or had he already convinced himself this was a mistake? When the call finally came, my heart nearly stopped. I answered with trembling hands, the words from the clinic staff barely registering as they confirmed what I had dared to hope. It was a match. My knees buckled, and I had to sit down, my breath coming in shallow gasps. It was him. After all these years, after all the prayers and tears, I had found my son. I called Alex immediately, my fingers fumbling with the phone. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "The results are in." There was a pause, heavy and tense. "And?" "They confirmed it," I said, barely able to get the words out. "You're my son." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, Alex," I began, but he interrupted me. "I need time," he said quickly. "This is a lot. I don't know what to think." "I understand," I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." "Okay," he murmured before hanging up. I sat there, the phone still in my hand, the weight of the conversation settling over me. It wasn't the reaction I had hoped for, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a step, a hesitant, uncertain step, but a step nonetheless. The next time I saw Alex, it was at the cemetery. He was sitting by his adoptive father's grave, his guitar resting on the ground beside him. He didn't look up as I approached, but he didn't tell me to leave either. "Hey," I said softly, lowering myself onto the grass nearby. "Hey," he replied, his voice distant. We sat in silence for a while, the breeze rustling the leaves overhead. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know how to do this." "Neither do I admitted. "But maybe we can figure it out together." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the headstone. "He was a good man, you know. My dad. He took me in when I had no one. He didn't have to, but he did." "I believe that," I said, my voice steady. and I'll always be grateful to him for taking care of you, for loving you." Alex looked at me then, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't want to forget him." "You don't have to," I said firmly. "He's a part of your story, just like I am. There's room for both of us." He nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I don't know if I'm ready to call you Dad, not yet." "I can wait," I said, my chest tightening. "Take all the time you need." For the first time, he smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but it was enough to make my heart feel lighter. "Thanks," he said quietly. We stayed there for hours, talking about his adoptive father, about the life he had built, about the man he had been. It was bittersweet, but it was also healing. I could feel the walls between us beginning to crack, the possibility of something new taking shape. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the cemetery in golden light, Alex picked up his guitar. "Can I play something?" he asked. "Of course," I said, my throat tight. He began to strum, his fingers moving with practiced ease. The melody was soft, haunting, filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. It was a song for the man who had raised him. But as I listened, I couldn't help but feel it was also a song for us, for the bridge we were slowly building between two lives, two worlds, that were finally coming together. The cemetery had become our meeting place, a quiet sanctuary where conversations flowed more easily than anywhere else. Each week, Alex and I would sit together under the shade of the old oak tree or near his adoptive father's grave. Our discussions were tentative, often circling around heavy emotions without diving in completely, but they were steady. With every word, I could feel the invisible wall between us beginning to crumble. One afternoon, Alex brought a small, tattered notebook. Its edges were frayed, and the cover had long since faded, but he held it with care. "This was his," he said, nodding toward the headstone. "My dad. He used to write down things he wanted to tell me but didn't always say out loud." I glanced at him, surprised. "He wrote letters to you?" "Sort of," Alex replied, flipping through the pages. Sometimes it was advice, other times just little notes about his day. He wasn't great with words, so this was his way of, I don't know, connecting. "That's beautiful," I said, my chest tightening at the thought of a man I'd never met caring for my son in such a profound way. "Do you ever read them?" Alex nodded, his fingers tracing the edges of the pages. "When I miss him the most, yeah. It helps." He hesitated, then handed the notebook to me. "You can look if you want. I think he'd be okay with it." I accepted the notebook carefully, feeling the weight of its significance. Flipping through the pages, I saw messy handwriting, phrases scrawled in the margins, and words that felt alive despite the years that had passed. One entry caught my eye. "Alex, you're stronger than you realize. You'll face things in this life that feel impossible, but don't give up. You're my son, and I'm proud of you." I swallowed hard, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. "He loved you deeply," I said, my voice trembling. "You were everything to him." Alex's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Yeah," he murmured. "He always made me feel like I mattered." "You did," I said gently, "and you still do." For a moment, silence settled between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice low. "It's strange, you know, having two fathers, one who raised me and one who wasn't there." The words stung, but I nodded, understanding the weight they carried. "I know I can't change the past," I said softly. "But I want to be here for you now, Alex. However you'll let me." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something that looked like hope. "I'm trying to figure out how to let you in," he admitted. "It's just hard." "I don't expect it to be easy," I replied. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." In the following weeks, we began to carve out small moments together, tentative steps toward building a connection. Alex showed me places he had frequented with his adoptive father. A small diner where they used to eat breakfast on Sundays, a park where they'd play catch, and a dusty old record shop where his father had introduced him to classic rock. At the diner, Alex ordered the same thing he always did, a stack of pancakes with extra syrup, and hesitated before adding, this was his favorite place. He said it made him feel like home. It's easy to see why, I said, looking around at the warm, welcoming atmosphere. Do you still come here often? Not as much, Alex admitted, poking at his pancakes. It's hard being here without him. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But I'm glad you brought me here. It helps me feel like I'm getting to know a part of your life I missed. Alex glanced at me, his expression softening. I guess I wanted you to know. He was a good man. I can tell, I said sincerely. And I'll always be grateful to him for taking care of you when I couldn't. One evening, we visited the park. Alex brought his guitar, sitting on a bench near the playground where he used to play. He taught me how to play, Alex said, strumming a few chords. It was his way of helping me focus when I got too restless. I smiled, watching him play. He must have been a patient teacher. He was, Alex said with a faint smile. He used to say, music won't solve all your problems, but it'll help you carry them. That's wise, I said, leaning back and letting the melody wash over me. Do you have a favorite song you play? Yeah, Alex said, his fingers moving deftly across the strings. It's one he wrote. He called it For My Son. He began to play, the notes soft and melancholic. The song was a tribute, an expression of love and pride that transcended words. Listening to it, I felt the depth of the bond they had shared, and though it stung to know I hadn't been part of it, I was grateful that Alex had been loved so deeply. When he finished, he looked at me, his expression tentative. I've been thinking about writing something of my own, for him. I think that's a beautiful idea, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And if you ever want help, I'm here. Alex nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thanks. The moments we shared were small, but they were significant. Each one felt like a step towards something I had thought I'd lost forever. I knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope, a bridge being built, one memory at a time. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the park as Alex and I sat beneath the sprawling oak tree. The same guitar he had played at the cemetery rested against his knee, and I could tell he was trying to muster the courage to share something. He'd been quieter than usual that day, his thoughts clearly preoccupied. What's on your mind? I asked, keeping my tone light. He looked up, his expression guarded. I've been thinking about something, he said slowly. About us. I straightened slightly, bracing myself for whatever was coming. Go on. Alex ran his fingers along the edge of his guitar, avoiding my gaze. I want to know more about before the flood, before I was adopted. I want to know who I was. My chest tightened at his words, a mix of relief and apprehension flooding me. I'd be happy to tell you anything you want to know, I said gently, but only when you're ready. He nodded, his jaw tightening as he seemed to weigh his next words. What was I like? As a kid, I mean. I smiled, the memories rushing back in vivid detail. You were curious about everything, always asking questions, always wanting to explore. You had this laugh. It was loud and contagious. Everyone who heard it couldn't help but smile. Alex's lips twitched, as if he wanted to smile but wasn't quite ready. That doesn't sound like me now. It's still there, I said with certainty. I've seen glimpses of it. You just haven't let it out in a while. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, what about my mom? What was she like? My breath caught. Talking about her was still painful, even after all these years, but Alex deserved to know. She was kind and fierce all at once, I said, my voice soft. She had this way of making everyone around her feel important, and she loved you more than anything in the world. Alex swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the neck of the guitar. Do you think she'd be proud of me? I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. Alex, she would be so proud. Of your strength, your resilience, your kindness. She'd be amazed at the man you've become." He looked down, his face unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "I wish I could have known her." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "She's still a part of you," I said. "Every time you show kindness, every time you fight for something you believe in, you're carrying a piece of her with you." Alex nodded, his expression softening. "I guess I never thought about it that way." Over the following weeks, our conversations grew deeper. We visited places that had once been important to our family. A lake where we used to have picnics, the small library where his mother used to read him stories, and even the house we had once called home. The house had been sold years ago, but we stood outside the gate, peering in at the overgrown garden and the peeling paint on the shutters. "That was your room," I said, pointing to a small window on the second floor. "You used to climb out onto the roof to watch the stars." Alex tilted his head, as if trying to summon the memory. "I don't remember that." "That's okay," I said quickly. "Maybe someday you will, or maybe we'll just make new memories instead." He glanced at me, his expression softer than usual. "I'd like that." One evening, as we sat in my small living room, Alex brought up a topic I hadn't expected. "I've been thinking about school," he said, his voice tentative. "I never finished. It just didn't seem important after my dad died." I leaned forward, surprised but pleased. "Do you want to go back?" He hesitated. "I think so. I don't want to keep working dead-end jobs forever. I don't know if I can do it." "You can," I said firmly. "And I'll support you in any way I can. If this is what you want, we'll make it happen." Alex studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Why are you so sure about me? You barely know me." "Because I see you, Alex," I said simply. "I see your strength, your potential, and I believe in you, even if you don't yet." He looked away, but not before I caught the glimmer of emotion in his eyes. "Thanks," he murmured. As Alex began taking steps toward rebuilding his life, our bond deepened. He invited me to one of his gigs at a small coffee shop, where he performed a mix of covers and original songs. Watching him on stage, his confidence growing with each note, I felt a swell of pride that threatened to overwhelm me. Afterward, he joined me at my table, his face flushed from the applause. "What did you think?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes betraying his nervousness. "You were incredible," I said honestly. "You have a gift, Alex." He smiled faintly, his shoulders relaxing. "Thanks. I've been writing something new. It's not finished yet, but it's about you and Mom." I froze, the words sinking in slowly. "I'd love to hear it when you're ready." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "It's not just about the past," he said quietly. "It's about now. Us." I swallowed hard, unable to speak. Instead, I reached out, placing a hand over his. He didn't pull away. For the first time in years, I felt like the pieces of my broken heart were beginning to come together, and I knew, deep down, that we were on the right path, one step closer to healing, one step closer to being a family again. The day was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the somber tone of our earlier meetings at the cemetery. Alex had invited me to join him at the gravesite of his adoptive father. It was the first time we'd be there together, and I could tell it meant something important to him. His guitar was slung over his back as usual, but today he also carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. We walked in silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound. When we reached the grave, Alex knelt down, placing the flowers gently at the base of the headstone. For a moment, he stayed like that, his head bowed, his lips moving in a silent prayer or conversation. I hung back, giving him space, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. Finally, he stood and turned to me. "I wanted you to be here because, well, I think he'd like to know about you," Alex said, his voice steady but soft. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Thank you for bringing me. It means a lot." Alex gestured toward the grave. "He was a good man. Everything I am, I owe to him." "I can see that," I said. "He must have been incredible to raise someone like you." Alex's lips curved into a faint smile. "He used to tell me that family isn't just about blood, it's about love, about being there for each other no matter what." I felt the words resonate deep within me. He sounds like the kind of man I wish I could have met, and the kind of father I hope I can be for you now. Alex glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his gaze softening. I think he'd be okay with that. In the weeks that followed, Alex and I began to create something that resembled a real relationship. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of awkwardness, moments where old wounds resurfaced, but we were trying. For the first time, we were moving forward together rather than dwelling on the past. One evening, Alex invited me to his small apartment. It was modest, sparsely furnished, but it had a warmth to it that reflected his personality. He had set up his guitar and a small microphone in the corner of the room. "I finished the song I told you about," he said, gesturing toward the setup. "The one about us." I froze for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "You did?" He nodded, pulling out a stool and sitting down. "I've never shared anything this personal before, but I think it's time." I sat on the couch, my hands resting on my knees, as Alex began to play. The melody was slow and haunting, the kind of song that seemed to fill the room with emotion. His voice was clear, every word cutting straight to the heart. He sang about loss and longing, about the pain of searching for something you thought you'd never find. But he also sang about hope, about finding light in the darkest places, and about building something new from the ashes of what was lost. By the time he finished, my face was wet with tears. I tried to speak, but no words came. Alex set the guitar aside and looked at me, his own eyes glistening. "Do you like it?" he asked quietly. "It's beautiful," I said, my voice breaking. "It's everything I've ever wanted to tell you but didn't know how." Alex nodded, his expression serious. "It's how I feel too. I'm still figuring it all out, but I want this. I want us to be a family." My chest swelled with emotion, and I reached out, pulling him into a tight hug. For a moment, he stiffened, but then he relaxed, his arms wrapping around me. It was the first time we had embraced, and it felt like a bridge finally crossing the chasm that had separated us for so long. The following week, we returned to the cemetery together, this time to visit my wife's grave. Alex carried a single lily, his steps slower and more deliberate than usual. When we reached the grave, he hesitated for a moment, then knelt down, placing the flower gently at the base of the headstone. "Hi," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here, but I'm here now." I stood back, watching as he spoke to her, his words quiet and heartfelt. It was a moment I had dreamed of for years, and now that it was happening, I could barely hold back my tears. When Alex stood, he turned to me, his expression earnest. "I hope she'd be okay with this, with us." "She'd be more than okay," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "She'd be overjoyed." Alex nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Good, because I think I'm starting to feel like I belong here, with you." "You always have," I said. "It just took us a while to find our way back." The story doesn't end there, of course. There's no neat conclusion to something as complicated as finding your son after so many years apart. But as we sat together that evening, talking about music, life, and the future, I realized that we didn't need a perfect ending. We just needed a new beginning. Alex picked up his guitar again, strumming a soft melody. "Do you think we'll be okay?" he asked, his voice quiet. "I do," I said without hesitation. "As long as we have each other, we'll be more than okay." And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. The early morning breeze whispered softly through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the towering oaks. Alex sat beside his adoptive father's grave, the familiar notebook resting in his hands. His expression was calm, but his eyes shone with a blend of longing and quiet acceptance. Beside him, I held a bouquet of wild flowers, a simple gesture laden with meaning. He was the first to show me what it really meant to be loved, Alex said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but a hint of sadness lingered. For the longest time, I thought I wouldn't need anyone else. He was everything. I nodded, letting the weight of his words settle between us. He was a remarkable man, Alex. Everything you've shared about him. He didn't just raise you. He gave you roots and wings. Alex gazed up at the sky, lost in thought. And now I realize he wanted me to have room to grow, to open myself to other things, other people. I placed a hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the strength and vulnerability in the young man beside me. He gave you the foundation to keep building, to let more love into your life. Alex looked at me then, his expression softer than I'd ever seen. I think he'd be okay with this. With us. I swallowed the lump in my throat, my voice steady despite the wave of emotion washing over me. I know he would. He loved you, Alex, and he'd want you to have as much love and support as you can. We sat in silence for a while, the quiet filled with unspoken understanding. Alex opened the notebook, flipping to a familiar page. He used to write little notes about me, he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Things he wanted to say, but couldn't always find the right words for. He handed me the notebook, and I read a passage written in a slightly shaky hand. Alex, the greatest gift in my life has been watching you grow. You're stronger than you think, kinder than you know, and braver than you feel. No matter where life takes you, never forget, you'll always be my son, and I'll always be proud of you. Tears blurred my vision as I handed the notebook back. He saw you, Alex, for everything you are. Alex closed the notebook and placed it carefully back in his bag. And now, I think I'm ready to see myself the way he saw me. Maybe even the way you see me. I smiled, feeling the bond between us solidify. You're everything he believed you could be, Alex, and I'm honored to be part of your story now. As we stood to leave, Alex hesitated, glancing back at the grave. I'll keep coming here, he said softly. Not because I'm stuck in the past, but because it reminds me of how far I've come and how far I can still go. I nodded, my heart full. He'd want that for you. We walked out of the cemetery side by side, the sunlight breaking through the clouds overhead. It wasn't a perfect ending, life never is, but it was a step forward. Together, we carried the love of the man who had raised Alex and the hope of the future we were building, one day at a time. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story about love, loss, and second chances, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below.